It would, but it's just given some issues.
Okay, no problem at all. All right, and we're live. Good afternoon, everyone. Apologies for a bit of a late start today. We had some issues outside of our control, but welcome again for those who have been following our sessions over the past few months. As you know, this is part of the Blue Umbrella Day campaign, which really raises attention on the violence that young boys face. You know, it's really an under-discussed issue, and we're still in 16 days of activism, and so we thought it very important to have with us today men who have been working in the area, who have knowledge and experience that they can share. So welcome to you both, Hassani and Milton. If you can both just go ahead, whoever wants to go first, just briefly introduce yourself to those who might be watching.
Hi, everyone. Pleasant good afternoon. My name is Milton Smith. I'm currently employed by the Ministry of Human Services and Social Security under the Child Care and Protection Agency, where I work as a Senior Probation and Social Services Officer with responsibility for Regions 1 and 8. I am not directly stationed in these regions, but I have overseer responsibility to ensure that I provide guidance to the police and the hospital, whoever needs guidance and child protection issues in these regions. I can provide guidance for them. From time to time, I would visit the regions to find out what is happening and to do interventions where necessary. At the agency here, the person that has direct responsibility over me is my director, Mrs. Anne Green, and I am hereby representing her on this forum. And I look forward to sharing information where necessary on the topic being discussed.
Good afternoon, viewers. My name is Asani Tini. I'm the Monitoring and Evaluation Manager at ChildLink. We're a non-profit organization. We focus on providing services through projects for children who are either at risk or victims of abuse. And I look forward to a very fruitful and engaging discussion this afternoon.
Thanks so much, Hassani and Milton. So I know when it comes to, there was recently the launch of the report that was really awaited for a long time, and it really brought out a lot of things that were very important. You know, in Guyana, we can spitball a lot of times about the issues that impact women, particularly children, but we don't really have a lot of data to really support it. And so it was really important that this research was able to just kind of highlight some of the impacts that it has, and we're able to have just like a statistical evidence to really reference. So one of the things that was really brought out in the report was the lack of conversations that a lot of parents just don't have with their children when it comes to sexual violence and abuse. So I'm curious about whether, you know, you're both adults, whether when you were both children, if you ever had a conversation with your parents about sex, sexual abuse, what that might have looked like or not looked like.
For me, no, it has never happened with my parents. I grew up in the old-fashioned home. Certain topics were taboo, certain topics were not for children. We could not have been engaged on the issue of sex, and so it is when I actually started my formal learning at the University of Guyana and my interaction with my church group is when I started to be exposed to certain topics like sex and sex education, and to help me to understand as a man what these concepts really mean, and to have a deeper understanding. So these were not topics that were discussed in my home. And I know you will ask the question eventually, if it is topics that are being discussed in my home right now, yes. but it was not topics that were discussed with me, but it's topics that I have discussion even with my 2 and my 4-year-old girls.
Milton, just on that point, I'm really glad that you mentioned that it's a conversation that is happening in your home. So, as you know, you mentioned like a lot of times parents back in the day, they would think that certain topics are just not for children, period. And so a lot of times they just tend to learn from their peers or media, which is not the best place to learn. So what does the conversation that you have with your children, what do they look like? What are some of the things that you tell them?
All right, then I will discuss the concept of the private square, private parts, who should touch your private part, who should not touch your private part, why is it considered a private part, identifying them. My daughters haven't reached that stage where they ask where babies come from as yet, but I am preparing my mind for that discussion. Not to give too much details that would lead to further wide questions. At this age, you know, the children ask a lot of whys, why, and every question comes with a why. So it helps you if you're not tactful. You have to be very careful. But these are some of the discussions that I had and I'm having with my 2-year-old daughters and my 4-year-old daughters. So yes, those are some private parts, and where we have, like I said, we haven't reached to that aspect of where babies come from yet, but I know it is going to come.
Yeah, it's really good that you started a conversation so young at 2 and 4. I mean, a lot of times parents would tend to wait until they're teenagers if the conversation even ever happens. So it's always good to ensure that children have that information from young, and of course that is age appropriate. So thanks so much for that. Hassani, want to give this a shot?
Sure. Like Milton, I grew up in an old school environment, and the issue of sex and sexual abuse was not discussed in my home. Interestingly, when I was about, I think 9 or 10 years old, my mother gave me a book. And this book looked at how children are conceived. And that was, my mom and I, because I grew up in a single parent home, we never had that conversation about sex or sexual abuse. The closest thing I came to having a conversation was through that book, where I read. It was an age-appropriate book, but I read and I discovered things. Another point that in reflecting on this question, I noted was in my community, there was a man who had I think it was a guava tree in his front yard. And what he used to do, he used to ask little girls to go and pick fruits from the guava tree. And I think the adults in the community at that time, and we're talking quite a few years ago, because I'm not as young as I used to be. So in that time, he used to invite these girls to go and pick these fruits from his trees, and he would stand up under the tree and he would stare at the girls. And I could remember my mom warning my cousin and a female friend, do not go into this guy's yard, right? So that was their conversation on sexual abuse. Interestingly, there was a male in my community, I didn't realize this until I got older, who had a reputation for luring boys into his home. And I found it interesting that no one ever spoke to me about that. I could recall hearing the girls, they were warned not to go into this man's yard and climb up on his tree. But no one ever had that conversation with me to say, you know, this guy is, if he ever approaches you, don't keep away from him. That never happened. So that was just, for me, in hearing this question, I reflect that I did not have that conversation, even though there was somebody there. No one had a conversation with me, but interestingly, the girls that I knew about, they were warned. So that question that you asked, in reflecting, that came to me.
Yeah, I think that was a very important point because a lot of times when it comes to sexual violence, it's a very gender dynamic where a lot of attention is focused on girls. And of course, like when we're talking about statistics, they're mostly represented when it comes to reporting. But we also have to think about the flip side of that and why boys don't report. So what do you think were some of the reasons that you weren't necessarily warned about this predator of young boys in your community?
Well, I think it's because I guess my parents and the adults in the community at the time believed that I wasn't at risk or the other boys weren't at risk. Because the young boys in my street, we never talked about this guy. We didn't know. I know we didn't know because we were young, we were naive, we didn't have certain knowledge. But I think or your parents would tell you is not to talk to strangers. So I think it was one of the reasons that contributed to it. I don't think our parents or the adults realized the risk that, or the potential danger that we were in. I think they took it for granted, but I believe it's because of a lack of education and a lack of awareness on their part, because this wasn't the age of the internet and technology. These were more simple times.
I think the other thing is that it was constantly being sold that boys are brave. Boys can protect themselves. We don't have to worry about them. We could allow them to walk late at night. We can allow them to go and play and do all the things that we don't allow girls to do. But what we would have done is constantly expose them to unconscious violence, unconscious situations where they can be violated. And the whole notion that, that boys, even if a boy got hurt, he wouldn't feel that inclined to go and tell anybody because he would be seen as a sissy or he would be seen as a girl. The whole notion of you shouldn't cry even if things are happening to you. The whole notion of if you go and complain, then the way you'll be seen by society, the stigma that is attached that if you were sexually violated as a young man and anybody knows about it, you'll be seen as a girl, as a homosexual, and all of these things that are attached to it that rids you of your humanity, of your gentleness. That is attached to all of these things that created that atmosphere that allowed you to not want to even go and speak about it if something like that would have happened to you. And in these dolly houses scenarios that used to happen in those old, a lot of things happened, not only to girls, but happened to boys. But boys could not have gone and speak about it because you would have gotten some real lashes, because it was felt that you were responsible for taking care of you as a boy, or you were responsible for taking care of your sister, to ensure that the family is kept safe. Nobody's exposed to danger. All of these things compounded the issue that we're now facing, that caused us to be in the situation partially that we're in.
Milton, you just highlighted some really great points when it comes to a lot of the gender stereotypes that helps to contribute towards child sexual abuse, particularly against young boys. One of the points you mentioned was as it relates to the idea that, if a young boy is sexually abused, his sexuality is automatically brought into question. How do you think things like that can impact not only reportage, but also the safety of young boys in general?
Go to question one more time for me, please.
Yeah, so I was asking about when it comes to sexuality and child sexual abuse, a lot of times when young boys are abused, one of the things they fear is being labeled as a homosexual. And of course, this can impact not only the reportage of the crimes that are committed against them, but also significantly places them at a risk, because abusers know that this is how they think. They know that is how society thinks. So I'm curious about what you think are some of the impacts of these gendered stereotypes as it relates to child sexual violence.
Well, we're seeing them flowing out in our society now. Some of them are aggression. We wonder where this aggression is coming from. This pent-up aggression is coming from young men. These acts of domestic violence, why we're seeing so many of that. And that can be linked to the fact that childhood issues have not been addressed. They have not been talked about. And so it is like a Coca-Cola bottle. You know that it has all of that gas inside of it. And when you shake it up and all of that gas build up, when you open it, there's an overflow. And you have this pop-out experience. And so we would have learned that once issues are not addressed and some people are good at covering them up until a certain situation occurs in their life that blows it up or the volcano explodes. And so that is what has been happening consistently in our society, where we're seeing the aggression coming from some young men because there were issues that were never addressed. There's a story, I don't know how true it is, but a young man and a young woman was walking on a particular seawall at a time, and I think you probably would have heard about it, but I think it's partially frictional. But I just share it so that the concept can be understood, how men feel and how men react. And, both of them were cornered, and the perpetrator would have assaulted both of them. They both went to the police station, and when they went to the police station, the young man spoke about the young lady's experience and failed to highlight that he too was violated. And the young lady turned to him and said, you're telling them about my experience and my violation, but what about what they did to you, right? But he was so comfortable in talking about what would have transpired with the young lady, but failed to highlight that he too was violated because of society creating this whole concept that a young man should not speak about how they were violated. And so that alone tells you that, listen, hey, what is happening here? Is it wrong to say that something would have happened to you so that you can get the necessary help, right? And I think that is where we need to start looking, and that's where we need to start focusing on, that young men need to start highlighting their issues so that they can get help where necessary. We feel as though we need to be strong, we need to be macho, we shouldn't be talking about certain issues. But I want young men who are listening and older men who are listening, it's time for us to talk about those issues. It's time for us to find somebody who we can confide in and we can express how we feel and not feeling less macho or feeling less of a man.
I also think, Akola, expectations, societal expectations of men and boys and manhood, that contributes to, as you said, the lack of reporting or fear in reporting. Because as Milton alluded to, men are expected to be strong. They're expected to protect yourself. Your manhood is defined by your ability to represent yourself, as we say in colloquial terms. And if you cannot represent yourself, you're not seen as a man, you're seen as a sissy or whatever term you want to put it as. And so for young boys, knowing that if you would have been violated, you will not be equated as a man. And based on the pressure that would cause in a society where heterosexuality is seen as quote unquote right, that places pressure on a young person to come and report. Also, the fact that it's not just the gender stereotypes, it's the fact that things can be amplified on social media. You may make a report or you may confide in a family member, and in a week's time or less, your situation can become national news without even going to Starbucks. It can be amplified on Facebook, on Twitter or Instagram. So I think it's the expectations that men, each boy and man is expected to meet, that nobody should be able to disrespect us, or nobody should be able to threaten us in any way. I think that expectation and the repercussions that come from not living up to that expectation is one of the reasons why it's so difficult for certain young men to report abuse.
Permit me to draw from the Childlink's report that was published, and chapter 5, it talks about safeguarding masculinity. And let me just read a caption of this report that I liked. It says, culturally, a male, even a young one, is expected to be tough, strong, and resilient to represent his manhood. His inability to protect himself places him at risk of abuse within the family and community, right? And that alone, his inability to protect himself places him at risk of abuse within the family and community. So the fact that you might be deemed soft, right? Or you might be deemed not too macho or not too masculine, people feel as though they can take advantage of you. And a lot of young men have been taken advantage of because of that notion, right? And then placed in an environment where they feel, as though they're betrayed, and the person would have taken advantage of them.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. It's a very important issue when it comes to just having those conversations and ensuring that we identify the role that they have. I'm curious about what are some things that can be done as it relates to negating or lessening the impact of gender stereotypes and expectations when it comes to young boys and manhood?
Well, I think it starts with us as adults. I think there's a societal responsibility to ease the pressure on young men, especially, on children in general, to come forward and report. Because one of the obstacles that hinders a child from coming forward is, what will people say about me? What is going to be said about me? How will people look at me differently? So I think there's some level of responsibility on society to encourage or to create a safe space, or create safe spaces where it's okay to admit that something would have occurred to you. It's okay to admit that you would have been violated, and there is help available. Too often, as Milton also made this point, with young boys, there's the expectation on you, the potential victim. You have a certain responsibility, or too much of a responsibility. You have to protect yourself. And, you know, we, boys and girls, they need protection. They need protection not just from their parents, but from the community and society as a whole. So I think there's too much responsibility on children, boys and girls. And as adults, we have to play our part in ensuring that we take on some of the responsibilities that we have to ensure that both boys and girls are protected.
Yeah, you know, ultimately, a lot of times when it comes to these conversations, it really, truly does begin in the home. And I know like a lot of people would get tired of hearing us say that, but honestly, that's where it really starts, having those conversations, letting children know that you're a safe person that they can come to. Because a lot of times children might be abused, but one, you never had a conversation with them, so they don't even know what has happened. And even if they did, if they're in an environment where they feel unsafe, they might not want to come forward with that abuse. So it's always important to ensure that children are able to know they can come to you for anything. And so when it comes to, and another point on that, you know, a lot of times too, is that persons tend to see abusers as being strangers in the dark, just trying to pounce on you, when the reality is that a lot of times it's much closer to home. What do you think are some of the most common places that young boys are more vulnerable to child sexual abuse?
Before I go to your question, let me add a little bit more to the previous question that was asked. The whole notion of what we can do, and Asani alluded to some of those points. Yes, indeed. The report would, and I have to constantly make reference to ChildLink's report, since most of the data is already there. We have to share it for those who might not be able to read it in entirety, but we can share a few of the points. And one of it would have highlighted that there's greater outdoor supervision for preteens and early teen boys. We feel as though we don't need to supervise them, but we need to supervise these children. We need to supervise their interaction. I would have added a conversation with my daughter, and you know, she would have indicated to me that a child would have, she went to use the washroom, and a child would have locked the door while she was in the washroom. And being a father, I was upset for that action, because I know the trauma it could put my child through. And I myself, I'm wondering how many children probably have been locked in washrooms and bullied because of their age, and they're sharing washrooms with older children. And when they go to the washrooms, you know, they might not know to do everything as an older child may know to do, and they might need that guidance. And you know, I would say and this is me answering the other question that you would have asked, because a lot of children are being abused in school washrooms, right? Being taken advantage of by other children, right? Who might be exposed. And this is me drawing from that little conversation that I would have with my daughter, and she would have expressed to me, and I would have felt the hurt that she would have experienced by what she was saying. And so I am saying that probably we need to implement a monitor in the school, in washrooms at schools, whether male or female, so that when children go in there, they're not alone, but there's an adult there, not directly in the washroom, but maybe at the door, who listens, or who knows what is happening, and periodically check to see what is happening, right? Drawing from the report also, it highlighted upskilling boys and parents, and drawing from it, it says boys have been socialized through a code of masculinized communication, which inhibits them from expressing their feelings and accepting aggression and abuse as normative, right? We should not see that type of interaction as normative. We should see it as something that is unacceptable, right? The way we interact, the way we handle our male child, we should be careful. They need to be treated with the same level of gentleness that we express to our females, right? It's all right don't make them feel as though if we are expressing this tenderness towards them, it's intruding on their masculinity or their maleness, but it helps them to understand that it's okay to receive and hug. And that's something that we probably need to be doing a little bit more. It's hugging our boys, and fathers hugging their boy child, so that it is understood that it's okay for a man and man to embrace each other. So I've answered your question in two parts, and I have given my recommendation in the not recommendation, but I would have given one of the suggestions of what we can do and where boys also can be abused. We feel as though it is this public abuse, but it's also when they're playing dolly house too. When they're playing games, when they're on the ball field, when they're in these sports clubs. And I see that the ministry and other organizations are going to these sport clubs and interacting with these coaches to bring a little bit of more awareness on what can be done and be observant of some of the sexual behaviors exhibited between male and male.
I think when it comes to the gender stereotypes, which Milton touched on and what we can do, we tend to ignore the fact that females can abuse boys. And a lot of young boys believe that if I am, let's say, 13, 14, and a woman in her late 20s or 30s approach me, that's a good thing. That's not abuse, because for males, it is a rite of passage to have sexual conquest, and it's even more impressive if you are if your sexual experience is initiated with an older woman. So we need to educate young men that that is not the case. That is abuse. That is somebody who is grooming you and taking advantage of you. So this notion that females cannot abuse males, I think that is something that we have to address, because as Milton said in the report, one of the respondents said a female cannot abuse a male. So these are things that persons genuinely believe, that females cannot abuse males. So it's happening, but it's just not being reported. And if you read the report, you'll see there were a few instances where mothers said, I know of this woman or that woman who is engaging young boys. But they say it, but there's no proof that they would have reported it, or even those parents themselves see it as that bad that it's worth reporting. Now, another issue that we need to address is the fact that men are not socialized, or boys are not socialized to be expressive. The report said that if you're a boy and you're expressive, you're seen as anti-male. And that is something that we need to address, because the report alluded to the fact that a lot of the reasons why boys continue to be abused is because they do not have the language to communicate that I've been hurt or this is happening to me. And that inability for boys to express themselves and to communicate what is happening with them is placing them at risk.
Thank you both so much for that. I think that a lot of the points raised were really important today, and it's things that you generally don't hear a lot being discussed. The last point you made, Hassani, regarding female abusers is definitely something that I've heard over the years so many times from young men. And you know, the reality is that a lot of them were abused when they were younger by older women or older girls. And it's usually seen as a notch in their belt or some huge accomplishment for them, without them recognizing that it's actually abuse. So I do think that is a very important point to focus on. So that brings me an end today to the questions that I have. But if you think there are points that are important to highlight that I might not have asked, please feel free to share.
Well, one thing I'll say in relation to the last question that you asked, where are boys being abused, it's anywhere where a perpetrator has access to them. Now, the report indicated that more than likely, boys are more likely to be abused outside of the home, where they're engaging in unsupervised activities, whether it's with older males or with their peers. However, there were a number of examples given. There was one example of it happening on public transportation. I guess the young man, he was sitting next to the driver, and as he was leaving the bus, the driver would have touched him on his genitals. So a young boy can be abused anywhere, especially in a situation where there's no supervision. Anywhere he can, as long as the perpetrator is there and there's no supervision, that young man is vulnerable. In some cases, it's even at sporting activities, because the report alluded to a boy who was playing cricket and he was abused somewhere on the cricket ground by, I guess, one of his peers. So while young boys are more than likely to be abused outside, it's basically anywhere where there's a lack of supervision.
Permit me, and I want to piggyback on a point that Asani would have made in terms of the language, having the language to communicate. You know, if you're sitting among your menfolk and you're having a conversation about some incident would have transpired and would have happened to you, where you felt violated, you know, it's not something that is acceptable. It's not a conversation that is acceptable, and not one that will give you much support and allow you to be seen in a positive light among your menfolk. And I would encourage that if there's a men's group and men are talking about issues, and should there come up that an issue where a man feels as though he was violated, then level of support should be given to encourage him to take the necessary approaches, to seek the necessary help that he might need for healing, right? Indeed, children can be abused anywhere. Violence is not specific to any special environment. Wherever the perpetrator feels as though he has an opportunity to exhibit that level of power, they will do it. And we have seen over the years on social media, on Facebook, where young men were even abused in the church, right? Young men were even abused in the church, an environment that is supposed to be a secure environment, and abuse at school and some other environments. So I say this, I join with you, Asani, in saying that indeed, wherever the perpetrator feels that he can exhibit that power, he or she, because I can't make it gender specific, he or she will do it. And the whole notion, and added to that, the whole notion that men are the abusers, men are the aggressors, we need to develop a different understanding in our society. Both men and women can be aggressive.
Thanks so much for that. I'm now seeing that there was a question on the Facebook page. They were asking about some of the precautionary measures. I think you guys would have touched briefly on this already. Things such as ensuring that young boys and teenagers are supervised outside, having conversations as it relates to sexual abuse, and just the same attention that you usually share with girls, just ensuring that you also have that focus on young boys, because they're usually left out of the conversation. Was there anything else you might have wanted to add to that question?
Well, I think there needs to be greater awareness. I know that prior to the pandemic, ChildLink, we would have gone to organizations and engaged adults who were working there on different forms of abuse and how it can be prevented. And of course, the pandemic would have shifted things a bit, where those kind of engagements, we don't really have it as much, but I could see the value in it based on when we did it. The reaction that we got from adults, of course, many of whom were parents, and the fact that generally things that we in this field take for granted that everybody should know, unfortunately, it's not always the case. So the need to reach out to John Public, I think is something that can serve as a precautionary measure to give them that knowledge so that now they can go and apply it at home.
Definitely. All right, if there are no more thoughts, thank you both so much for taking the time out of your day to share with us. It was a very insightful session and a lot of important points were raised. And I hope that persons will be able to utilize these videos for not only their own education, but for those around them, because it's only through that constant knowledge sharing that we'll be able to get where we need to be. So thanks once again and enjoy the rest of your day.